I ended with talking about the question of interest. And there is in the meantime a quite long debate on the European level, meaning in the European Union, on general interest, services of general interest, services of general economic interest. What I think is interesting in this context here is the overall framework of this debate. It had been in 1993 that Jacques Delors published, or his commission published, a central white paper. Central meaning it was hugely important, and it came from the presidency level of the commission rather than from one of the DGs. The title, Growth, Competitiveness, Employment, the Challenges and Ways Forward into the 21st Century, a white paper published under the number COM 93-700, December 93. This paper mentioned to a relatively large extent, at least if you see it in the European debate, the question of certain niches existing in our societies, in the economies of our societies, which are not part of the economic process, but that can be utilized to a very large extent to be included into this economic process. Growth, boosting growth, enhancing competitiveness and employment had been the topics. And under this heading, he came to the conclusion there are areas left out of the economic process, but that can be included. And not least, it was the time where cooperatives had been on the agenda of the European Commission. It had been the time where, as well, social policy was discussed for the first time explicitly as a major issue. Green paper being published in 93 and a white paper being published in 94. The title, European Social Policy, a Way Forward for the Union. White paper number 94-333. July, so it's about half a year later than the white paper on competitiveness. There was another important document published, and this was dealing with foundations, with non-governmental organizations, with the voluntary sector. The first time that the European institutions explicitly looked into this body, explicitly said, A, there is a social area, and we have to take care of it. There had been social policies before, since 75, since 73, and if you want, you can take it even back to 1957, although that is very doubtful. But definitely since 75, there had been some kind of progress. Only then, in 1995, there was this explicit mention of European social policy, a way forward for the Union. It was that time where there was explicit mention of other organizations than state and institutional organizations. So it is very important in our context, and it is as well important to see this as linked. It had not been competitiveness here and social policy there, but there was, I had been involved in some parts of these debates, there was this explicit link being established and a close collaboration between Jacques Delors and Patrick Flynn, who was at that time the Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs. At the same time, there was a debate on the status and character of social policy, actually. It had been later that the commissioner from Greece, Anna Diamantropoulou, proposed a triangle. Back to the triangle. It was economics, economic policies looking for growth. It had been employment policy, looking, of course, of how to get people into employment, into the labor market. And it had been social policy, being concerned, mind, with social quality. We had been in discussion with the Commission, with Anna Diamantropoulou as well, and she acknowledged the idea, the importance of the idea of social quality. But at the same time, what she did not understand, or what she could not understand, being commissioner, being involved, included, encapsulated in this system of policy making, that social quality is not something, a separate area where social policy can look after, but that social quality, in our understanding, was something that would be at the center. And then you could still have social policy, healthcare policy, childcare, looking for the elderly would be an area at this end of social policy, but it would be focus, the overall focus of social quality. And in this context, economic policies would contribute as well. In other words, you can say social policy was still very much thought as being an annex to the overall economic development. Growth, competitiveness, employment, one triangle, and this was very much the more important part, the guiding part for other policies, for social policies. And this had been this idea of annexing social policy and of thinking of social policy as flanking policies. This is important, I think, as well in terms of the European strategy when it came to the social economy. It had never been considered as being real part of the economy. It had been always thought to be a separate sector. It had been not thought that it could be entirely profitable and competitive, because not of the specific understanding of the social economy and cooperatives, but because of the specific understanding of the economic process. The economic process being concerned with growth, and growth being measured as matter of economic growth of GDP. At the same time, another document had been published, and this document opened another discussion. It was another document concerned with services of general interest. If we have a single market for goods, for commodities, for capital, and for workers, we should have one as well for services. This was the idea. And as much as aircrafts cross borders, the ownership and control of aircrafts, of airlines, should cross borders as well. It should be an open market that makes service delivery, service providers free, in this sense of not being national. Not only in terms of not being national, meaning providing service in other countries, but not being national as well in terms of ownership. As it's well known still at this stage, many of these providers, service providers, had been publicly controlled, publicly owned. Public airlines, national airlines, as Finnair, postal services, not DHL, but the Finnish Post, I don't know exactly the name here, but nationally owned post services, energy services, electrical boards, others, public transport, railways. The idea was really achieving a single market means overcoming what had been said to be an obstacle, namely public ownership. Get it out to the market, privatize it, deregulate it. All these terms are a little bit problematic because there are complex issues involved. It's not necessarily deregulation, it's very much a re-regulation, reforming or reformulating the ways of regulating these sectors. But at the end of the day, we find this idea of previously public services or services in the general interest, as they have been called, being provided via the market. There had been a huge debate on this, split between two angles, between two dimensions, two perspectives on it. The one said it's about the service industries. And services are many of them. The other said it's about network services. So we are talking about airlines, we are talking about postal services, we are talking about electricity, energy and transport, railways. Now many people said in the non-governmental, non-profit sector, as well in the area of cooperatives, this doesn't really bother us. This does not affect us because we are not network services. So we don't have to engage in this system, in this discussion, because we are providing services, and I'm hesitating, providing services of the general interest, but not network general interest. Then the Commission said, after a while, apparently this is not clearly defined, so we have to go into another debate, and we have another reissue that was in 2000, I think, another paper on this, clarifying things. And actually this made it even more difficult, that people did not say, well, this doesn't really affect us, but then people from these sectors have been getting aware, actually it affects us, it will affect us. But still, there was some hesitation in engaging in this debate, and they said, okay, we can still get by and don't foster this debate too much, because if we make them aware that we are really part of it, they may be getting aware of, and they will regulate this sector. Leave it to the national levels, leave it to the NGOs, leave it to the cooperatives. It was especially the housing sector, public housing, social housing, that was hugely affected. It was especially the sector of hospitals that had been hugely affected by this, because they had been operating on such a large scale in terms of finances involved that they definitely had been included there. The debate went on, and finally it came to the result that all these services, all these different forms of organizations had been fully included into the single market, that they are strictly, I said there is a problem with these terms, that they are strictly regulated in terms of deregulation. They are now fully part of the open market of the competition. This causes a huge problem as well for organizations of the cooperative sector. Cooperations being a specific niche in the entire system, not only because they are working in areas that are not covered by large enterprises, but because they have a different approach to what economy, what the economic process, what production is about. It is about the production of goods, of commodities, but it is as well about other interests being involved. There's a long debate, and there's quite a lot of historical and contemporary material on it. What are cooperatives? Starting from the movements of solidarities in the area of consumption, in the area of farmers going together because they couldn't compete with the large farms anymore, or they couldn't compete against the large chains obtaining of their products. It had been workers gathering together, building, founding cooperatives to be there as a kind of self-help, continuing long traditions coming from the guilds and trade organizations. I don't want to look at this. What I want to emphasize is that there is always, in these cooperatives, the idea of we are special in terms of having a different idea in which area we want to compete. We want to be competitive in the strict sense. But at the same time, even there, we have to include other areas. It is about production, but it is about looking under which conditions are we actually producing. Which rights do we have as workers? Which working conditions do we provide? There are different points coming then into different perspectives of these organizations, saying it is important as well to keep sustainability in mind. We produce competitive, but part of our calculation is that we do not exploit our soil or our means to such an extent that we cannot produce tomorrow anymore. Of course, this is a cost factor. I said on another occasion yesterday in a lecture, well, I mentioned a judgment actually here in Finland concerning a bus company, two bus companies, one of them going to the European Court of Justice. The reason was they provided a bus service for school children, bringing them from A to B, much cheaper than the other. Now, European legislation says you have to go for the cheapest offer. And they didn't. And the European Court of Justice said, nevertheless, it's okay. The procedure is somewhat dodgy, but it is okay to go to the more expensive offer, because this company in actual fact offered bringing children from A to B, plus doing it with buses that are up to standard. Environmentally friendly equipment, allowing to do the same job, a little bit more expensive, but actually adding something. Adding the value of environmentally friendliness. Now, the legal implications had been huge. There had been other judgments following, but this is a typical example, I think, for something which had actually not been done by a cooperative, but by a private bus service provider, saying we add something on it. The problem is, who pays for it? How get we on with including these organizations in a competitive market? Because usually competition is measured in financial short-term econometric terms. So how can we redefine actually the economy to say there is something that is important, and this is something that is important for individuals, but as well for society. Here you see at the end of this section that I'm actually coming back to the very beginning, saying looking at society is important, looking at what society is about is important, and it is not necessarily about providing individuals with goods and commodities to the lowest possible costs. But it is about having a wider understanding of what production is about. Production as a matter of consumption, of distribution, of exchange. Production as a matter of producing commodities, but producing at the same time something that goes beyond, namely social relationships. The paradox, again, is we need this as a matter of individual freedom, of individual development, but at the same time we need this as being guided by something who actually looks for the general interest and who enforces the general interest. I said there is no such thing as the general interest. As such, we have to define it. But this is exactly what we have to do, and this is exactly what we have to do in economic discussions. Talking about the social economy, we have to talk about socioeconomics at the same time. We have to take a wider view that goes beyond simple calculations. This would be then my 8th point, looking at the question of resisting obstacles. Are we actually talking about morals? Are we talking about management? Or are we talking about calculations?